Okay, so let's get started. We were talking to John, and we've been talking with John Pratt about this for quite some time, even more than a year, that there's desires out there to learn more about these sacred calendars, about astronomy, about what's going on in the heavens. And so he was here in our neighborhood, our fellowship, last year during the Wisdom Conference, and we were talking to him, and we've been asking John if he'd be willing to get on in a forum like this and just teach us. And so that's the result of us talking with John and his willingness to be able to share his knowledge of these things. And as pertaining to content, what John wanted to share with us is a tutorial that he's been putting together for more than a year that has 356 slides, John? Something like that.
Yeah.
And so we could methodically go through these slides. The objective is to spend about 30 minutes on the slides or on the tutorials or on these decks. And then after about 30 minutes, open it up for about 15 minutes for Q&A. And so that was the format. And I'm hoping that that works for everybody else. And of course, we'll jump in on the next week where we left off on the slide deck. And so if everyone's all right with that, that's the direction we would like to take right now. And with that, John, anything else before we turn it over to you?
No, I think we should get going.
Okay, let's go. I'll turn it over to you.
Because actually that was the format 15 minutes ago.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of changing the format because for the following reason.
Mm-hmm.
First the introduction and then how I want to change it a little bit. So I got the idea. I was doing the tutorials separately from anything to do with this. A year ago, I told Glenn that I'd be happy to do something like this, but I didn't really have the tutorial going. So the tutorial I made to Instagram in particular. And I saw Instagram as something that's a picture with a very short caption and people just zipping through it with no more time than to read most about a picture. So with that in mind, I saw most people used Instagram for sharing with the world what they had for breakfast, or for a factoid of the day that would stand by itself, some cute little interesting thing. But I got the idea to use it for a tutorial, meaning that I expect you to remember to look at it every day. I do one slide per day when I'm not in the hospital or something like that. And I expect everybody to remember every slide I've ever put up, So that's, I realize, totally unreasonable, but nevertheless, that's what it is. I've had several people say, we have time for more than just your one sentence. And so I've now been adding comments at the bottom. I've realized that I can make this into a book. I can take all of these and suddenly I've got a book. The good thing about this Instagram, this tutorial, is it's really forced me to think logically and one step at a time, and they need to know this before they know that, and that's all in preparation for this other. And so it's a really, I believe, nice logical presentation. I would like, if I make it into a book, to have comments, more text under the pictures. So I'm hoping to actually get your questions on each slide instead of waiting for the whole time at the end. And maybe there aren't any, maybe just one or two. We can't go too slowly. But Glenn, if it can be worked to somehow open it up after, let's try that, open after every slide. I've got a notebook here where I'm going to write down your questions. So please don't say, oh my goodness, this sounds like a dumb question. If you have a question, ask it, because nobody knows anything about this. This is all new. This is not in an astronomy class. you're in, this is the first one. I'm doing totally new things. Some of it's regular astronomy, but most of it with the sacred calendars is very, very new. So don't think that everybody else knows this and you don't. Therefore, it helps me if you ask these questions, because then I can do better explanations. Okay, now we're already 15 minutes into this. I'm really just going to start now. Oh, well, one other thought is that I'm thinking half an hour of presentation and maybe 10 slides I'm thinking we could cover each time. So something like 3 minutes per slide should allow maybe even half that time for questions. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go to slide, well, actually the slide 0, the very first one that comes up. Yes, it's designed to be read sequentially because the later pages may depend on remembering what was taught earlier. Oh, the nice thing about Instagram that's not on this my webpage is you can post former pictures. So sometimes when I say, hey, remember slide number 14 and 2 or 3 former slides on Instagram, I can just excuse me post those out to the side. You can swipe over and see them. On this one, I have a little go-to button at the bottom where if we need to do that, then Jared or whoever's doing it can type in that number of the slide at the bottom and it'll go see it. So, okay, with that in mind, let's go to slide number 1. So I'm just going to read it for those on the phone, and I'll try to make it for someone just listening that a lot of the pictures are just pretty pictures that you can live without. Others are diagrams that you really need to see, and we'll treat that individually. But this one says, this site is about sacred calendars. That's the name of it. It's on Instagram, it's sacred_calendars is the name.
Hey, John.
Yes.
This is Jared. Just to interrupt momentarily, perhaps if you could just mention where this would be visible for those who might be on the phone but have a computer in front of them.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, if you're on the phone, on the computer, you go to johnpratt.com, and that's my home page that has probably too much on it. And over on the right-hand column, there's a left-hand obvious column of hyperlinks, but you go over to the right side and the top thing on the right column says something like tutorial updated daily. So if you just click on that on my website, johnpratt.com, you will be right to where we are now.
And we were showing them, as you were saying that, John, we were showing them on the screen where it was. So.
Oh, how nice. Yes. But, except that wouldn't work for the ones on the phone, but that's okay. Yeah, great. Okay. So on the very first day, I made a note of what day it was. It said, this is about sacred calendars. It began on Saturday, 8th of July last year, 2017. Which was a holy day on 7 calendars. Each is discussed in future posts. So I do that just as to show something we're doing a lot, and that is what this really is all about. Is I'll be claiming that I now claim that the Lord is using all of these calendars, and that each one has a different purpose. Some of them, I don't know what the purpose is yet, but I do know that there's 1 or 2 that are especially for birthdays, and I'll comment on that now. The Hebrew, I've got uniform Hebrew here, but there's a Hebrew and a uniform Hebrew, and I'll explain that later. But Hebrew calendar is used for birthdays, And the sacred round, the top one, is used for birthdays. Oh, and today that we're starting is the day 1 temple on the sacred round. And that is the day that represents birth. It's temple is your body. We'll do this later, but as an intro, temple represents your body as a temple, and 1 temple is the beginning of when you get your body. And so some of the great patriarchs like Abraham is born on the day 1 temple, which is so today's Abraham's birthday on the sacred round calendar. Anyway, there's many calendars, and sometimes just knowing what day it is on all of them will tell a story, because each one has a different significance, and you put all those significances together on one day, and it can tell a story about what happens on that day. So and here's an example of what I didn't even know when I made this slide. I put the priest calendar day on there, and I had no idea what Pethahaya, however you say it, means. It's a name of a Hebrew family. And later in a slide, I translated all of those names to English, and that name means beginning. It's a day for a new beginning. And so it was a good beginning day. That's an example, see, of the story a day can tell. Okay, so I probably did all, let's not do questions on that one. I think I just used my 3 minutes. Let's go to slide number 2, which I can do by just pushing the one right arrow. You push the double arrow to the line, it takes you to the last slide. Okay, sacred calendars track time using repetitive motions of celestial bodies. Now that's huge. There's going to be a Venus calendar, a Mercury calendar, several kinds of sun calendars, moon calendars, but they all are somehow tied to it. Well, and the one celestial body is the Earth itself. So even a calendar that let's read the next sentence. All are based on the day as measured by the sun's daily cycle. So whether you consider the Earth to be turning or the sun to be going around once a day, because that's what it looks like, that is the definition of a day. And we're just seeing the sun go around once. And it's a very simple definition. You can mark it at noon, get a sundial and mark that, and all of them count days. That's the fundamental unit, and that's important. Any question on, tell me if there's any question on that.
John, I've got a question.
Okay.
If you're counting days, does the days start at noon and end at 11:59 a.m. the following day, or do they start at sunset?
You are a great straight man. That will be on the very next slide, I believe. So I'll answer that next. Any other question on this one? Okay, that is the day. Here we go. Next slide, number 3. When does the day begin? So people will think you were planted. These sacred calendars begin at either 6 a.m., noon, 6 p.m., or midnight, as shown below.
Yep.
So the Enoch, Hebrew, and Jubilee begin at 6 p.m. And that's the classic Hebrew calendar. I think most people know that the Hebrew day starts at 6 p.m. 2 of them start at midnight, the Venus and Mercury. There's reasons for these things. Venus and Mercury are both evening and morning stars. So they come up in the morning, but they'll come up before the sun. And then when the sun comes up, They usually disappear because the sun's so bright. It's, daytime, everything disappears. But you want the day to change on these calendars at a time that it doesn't interfere with looking at the object. The reason Venus and Mercury start at midnight is they are only evening and morning stars. They're never up at midnight. And so this way, whether you see it and the sun's just starting to rise or not, it's always the same day. The 6 a.m. is the sacred round, just one of them, and that's probably the single most important calendar. And it has its own little slot. And at noon is the opposite of Venus and Mercury. That's for the nighttime. That's the Mars and all of the outer planets. There's a Jupiter and a Saturn. I've just never done them yet. There's a lot of work to do still. But the outer planets that are outer, meaning farther from the sun than the Earth is, they are up all night. You don't want the day to change at midnight because how do you know exactly when it's midnight? And was it on this day or that day? So they change at noon when they're never up. And the priest calendar, I'm not sure why, but the priest calendar is tied also to that. And I get that because that's actually when they would change the priest at the temple in the Law of Moses. They had different priestly families, and the new priest would come in at Saturday noon and be there for 7 days. Anyway, they would change. It changed at noon, so I just got that from the actual. These are real calendars. Okay, now one more comment on this. That is, there's two kinds of calendars that can be made. Two very different types. One is the observational one, where you would not do it at 6 a.m., 6 p.m., but you would actually do it at sunset or sunrise in those two cases. Now, we all know that sunrise and sunset vary from, well, if you're not on daylight savings, it's around, instead of 6 a.m., it goes from 4 a.m. in the morning in the summer to 8 a.m. in the winter. It's a big change. So it'd make a huge difference. Like when a baby is born, what day are they born on? Well, it's really different if you're using an observational or 6 a.m. All of the sacred calendars I'm dealing with use average times. So the average day length is 24 hours. You divide it into 4 equal parts. When the calendars that track the moon track the sun, it's not where the actual moon is, or the actual sun, or the actual planet Venus. You do the average rate. For instance, the moon can go ahead or behind its position in the sky by more than a couple of diameters. And so on the sacred calendar, it might say that it's at the same position as this star or this planet on this day, and in real life, it's not that close to it. So all I know is the Lord really appears to be using these ones on the average days. He's also doing the real days. So the real one would be an eclipse of the sun, where the real moon, real sun are together. There's no eclipses on my sacred calendars because I shouldn't say mine. I have no proprietary on the sacred calendars because they're the time that it'll say they're both together on that day, but it won't really be an eclipse on that day or a real conjunction on that day. But the Lord seems to treat it as if there really were. Okay, now see, that's a lot of words. And by the way, as far as remembering, way up around slide 300, I started the star calendar. I never had a slide for a long time that said, by the way, the day starts at noon. I expected you to remember that from this slide. I finally did put it in one sentence somewhere as a reminder, but I'm fairly serious about remembering everything. So that's probably a weakness, and maybe I'll repent of that, but I'm trying to do, I got a lot of ground to cover. Okay, boy, I'm watching the clock here. I did more than 5 minutes on this slide. Still, I'll ask for any questions on this slide.
Yeah, John, this is Glenn. I have a quick question too. How many calendars are we dealing with total that you're addressing?
I've got 16, and there's 2 versions of most of them. So you really only learn about 8, or maybe it's 10. But some of those calendars are so easy, I treat them. The first one I do is the priest calendar, and it's so easy. I think I only spend, 5 slides. We'll probably only spend 1 night on that calendar. The star calendar, I have no idea how long it's going to go on. Every star has a different day and a different story and represents a different person, and that could get out of control pretty fast.
And so about 16, you're saying? How many?
Yeah, right now there's 16, and that's not counting. There's at least a bunch of others. There's no Jupiter or Saturn yet. So, but
that includes the 16. Uniform Enoch and the uniform Hebrew that you just.
Right. When I said the 2 versions, there's a Hebrew and a uniform Hebrew and things like that. But they are separate calendars, and they all. But you don't have to learn. You don't have to study them all twice. You study one, and you know them both.
Understood.
So there's really only about, I think, 10. It's either 9 or 10, I think, that require a little bit of learning.
Okay.
As I said, some are pretty simple. So, any other question on day starting time? Oh, yes, I'll ask a question. How do you know what time it is? Oh, that's a good question. Most of these, from what I can tell, work on local, but it's really local mean sundial time. I treat that in another slide, so I won't ask that. So the answer to that is, that'll be answered in a few slides. That's a good question, thank you. So let's move on. Okay, I'm on, here we're getting there now. Slide number 4. That shows a map of the whole world in the different time zones. And the time zones are not straight lines, but a bunch of little kind of crooked lines that have to do with including islands. Looks like Iceland is included with Britain's time zone, even though it's not in that area. So let's talk about time zones and what that's all about. Local time is the time at your longitude. And longitude is the east-west lines on the Earth. It's the time at your longitude that varies from city to city. Now, let me comment just on that. It used to be, before trains were invented, every city. In Salt Lake City, there was Orson Pratt had an observatory on Temple Square, and he's taken observations of the sun. And the clocks in Salt Lake City are set according to when the sun is due south at noon on a sundial, and that's called noon. But at another city, it's on another place on the Earth, it'll be at a different time. When trains came in, people didn't want to set their clock again at every city they came to. So they invented what's called standard time. So that's the next sentence. Standard time means all set their clocks to the same time in their time zone. So everybody said, what does it matter if you're 20 minutes off from real noon or whatever? It's more important for everybody in Utah to have their clocks synchronized. so that you can post on your thing. It's 8 o'clock in Utah, but then in California, they'll say, okay, it's 7 o'clock there, because when they change their clocks, they all change by a whole hour. And there's another sentence here. Time zones are centered every 15 degrees of longitude. Why 15? Because 25 to 24 times 15 is 360. So if you divide the whole Earth into 1 hour time zones, they're 15 degrees of longitude wide. So that's what all the lines are on that picture. They're 15 degrees of longitude. So the next sentence is get local time. Oh yeah, if you want your local time, you can correct it by 4 minutes for each degree off from the center of your time zone. So for instance, the Utah time is actually centered. If you look at where that line, well, you can't see it very well, but that line goes almost exactly through Denver, Colorado. So we're actually all setting our clocks in Utah to noon or whatever hour it is in Denver. And so if you really want to go out and read your sundial, you got to look up your longitude. Well, I think that's in the next slide. But anyway, that's what standard time is. Oh yeah, and then someone came up with the idea of daylight savings time. I remember the Indian analysis of that was only the white man thinks that by cutting off 1 foot off of one end of a blanket and sewing it onto the other end makes the blanket bigger. That was his, and that's, anyway, the idea, I believe, started in during World War II, when they wanted to have victory gardens, and so they wanted more light at night, so people got home earlier so they could work in their gardens to grow food. And it caught on, and so that's why they have the long nights in the summer, and you have to get up when it's dark to go to work. Okay, that's time zones. Any questions on time zones? All right, let's do one more, and that'll be probably enough. We're only going to get probably through 5 slides on our first shot here. We started at 8:15, and maybe we won't do 10 each time, because these are the easy ones. Okay, moving right along. Sundials. Oh yeah. So there's one, you could call it a problem with sundials or not. Sundials are always within 17 minutes of displaying the correct local time. And by that, I mean your local time on your watch. In other words, you want to know what time it is at your house. So you've done the calculation that I just said. You figured out your longitude. You've changed it by 4 minutes. You know, you've made that correction. So you now are looking for when it's noon on your sundial in your backyard, and you think it ought to be so many minutes off from the Denver from the standard time. You go out and look at the shadow when it's pointing due north, which would be noon. And it can be up to 15 minutes off, or actually 17, either way, faster or slow. The graph on this sundial face, and there's a little picture. If you look on most sundials that are public, that are serious, not just a garden decoration, but that are actually serious to be used for the sun to tell the time, there's a little graph on it. And it'll have a correction of up to 17 minutes, either plus or minus, for what day of the year it is. The reason for that is the sun is not, well, you don't need all of the reasons, but it has to do with the sun is not going around or the earth is not going around the sun in a perfect circle. And it's not going around in the same plane as the let's just say it's not going around in a circle. There's two reasons, and I don't want to go too much into it. And it's either can be a little fast or slow because it's not all like you might think it might be. So in real life, to use the sundial, A, you figure out where you are compared to standard time. And then B, you use that little graph to make corrections. And then you got it. You can read it to a minute and know what time it is. You can't read it more than that. When I was a kid, I wanted to build this huge sundial and read it to a second. And it turns out you can't do that. Because let's not cover that. But you can read it to a minute with a little effort. Okay, now let's pretend we're stopping there and ask any questions on anything here, and we might start from that point next time. Any questions?
Can we repeat the whole thing? Just kidding.
Oh, I'll ask a question. Hey, that's cool that you can tell noon on a sundial when it's pointing exactly north. But these sacred days, you say, start at also 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. How, if you don't buy a specially made sundial, how can you tell 6 a.m. and 6 p.m.? And that has a really simple answer. If you have most sundials have a tilted, just like in this picture. It's called a gnomon, G-N-O-M-O-N, gnomon, or a style, probably better English word. It's slanted. That slant is slanted to point up to the North Star. It points up to where the axis of the Earth is. So that's the line around which the sun is moving. If you have that kind of a sundial, 6 o'clock, and you can see it on this. You can see the numbers, Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you look at 6 o'clock, it is exactly a perpendicular right angle from the base of the style. It's exactly east, 6 o'clock. Well, as the shadow will be west. When the sun comes up in the morning, if it's 6 o'clock real time in the morning, sundial time, that shadow will point due west. And at 6 p.m., it'll point due east. So the lines in between are all hard to draw. You need trigonometry and fancy stuff. But you can make a sundial with north, east, west. Well, you don't need the south. Northeast and west. And you can get to 6 a.m., 6 p.m., and noon. I just think that's amazing. No matter what latitude, no matter where you are, that works. If in fact the sun is up at that time. If you're up in Alaska where it's night for 6 months, then you won't see your sundial. So you got to have the sun up to make that work. Okay. So that's the cool thing about sundials. Any other questions? There's a lot on each of these pictures. I'm surprised.
Is there variation, John, for true north versus magnetic north?
No, this is true north, which is where it's the point. No, nothing magnetic on a sundial. No magnets. It's a shadow. It's a north. Yeah, that's a good question. What's north? North is the direction around which the Earth is rotating. And it points up in the sky to a star called the North Star. But there's an axis of rotation of the Earth. And you can find it if you just look at the stars at night. You watch them for a while, and they all go in a circle. You all, I'm sure, seen pictures on Instagram, wherever you see pictures of a night sky, and all the stars are going in circles. The sun does it every day. The sun goes in a big circle around a point in the sky. The place it's going around is north. Oh, so one way Boy Scouts can find north, the sun, you just stick a pole a vertical pole in the ground. You put your level against it, see if it's vertical. And you notice it has a long shadow in the morning and in the afternoon, but around noon it has a really short shadow. At the moment its shadow is shortest, it's pointing north. That is north. So that's the true north and the simple way to find it. And that's kind of hard to tell, so there's other ways, but that's just a simple one to give you the idea. So that's what north is. And east and west are at right angles to north. Once you got north, you just do right angles and you got east and west.
So don't use your compass.
No, compass is no good. And by the way, magnetic north is wandering all over the place now. I have my Boy Scout book when I was a kid. I still have that, and it had wasn't just a Boy Scout book, excuse me, Boy Scout compass. And for Salt Lake City, Utah, the magnetic deflection was 17 degrees off of true north, meaning you set your needle at 17 degrees. And then in other words, it's that far off from true north, and then you'd know where true north was. Now the deflection in Salt Lake is 11 degrees. That's a huge difference. So they're repainting lines on runways, and people aren't real sure what even causes the Earth to be a magnet. You know, there's all these theories about a dynamo inside and whatever. But whatever it is, it can move around. The true north does not move around much at all. I mean, a few feet out of, you know, a big 8,000-mile diameter. So true north is pretty dependable.
So another quick question. This is Glenn. As we've been talking about this in orientation with calendars and time, why in Nauvoo, in their periodical, I think it was published, they had published publications every 2 weeks. Why was it so significant to the people in Nauvoo to name their paper Times and Seasons? Obviously, the whole element of keeping time and keeping track of the seasons was important. What's the big deal? And why does God want us to keep our eyes in the heavens?
Oh yeah, this is a long. This will have to do with the whole course. But the other one is, why did Joseph Smith, when they were in, where was it? Was there? I want to say Missouri. The other newspaper was the Evening and Morning Star.
Mm-hmm.
So they're new. So. But even the new ones, the New York Times, you know, I mean, newspapers tend to have stuff, they are talking about times and current events, but the ones of Joseph Smith, I don't know the story behind Times and Seasons, but Evening and Morning Star is huge because that usually refers to Venus. And Venus is going to be a huge, huge calendar in the sacred calendars. It's really important to understand, and we'll spend quite a bit of time on the Venus calendar. So, but this was a question I had as a kid. I would see that these prophets were astronomers. Abraham's an astronomer, Enoch's an astronomer. And, you know, I didn't see any that were chemists or microbiologists, or that's one reason I went into astronomy. I thought, God's interested in astronomy, and I'm not sure he's interested in all the other, you know, I mean, prophets were. Well, it turns out priests mostly kept the calendars, and so it was a religious kind of thing, and we'll talk about that. But as for the actual reasons on times and seasons, I don't know that one. I have no idea, but it's really important. Right in Genesis 14, we'll do this, and then I don't know how long people have. I don't want to go more than an hour. I was thinking 45 minutes usually for half an hour of talk and 15 of questions.
Well, we started like 15 minutes late because of the orientation and get everyone settled. Maybe at the top of the hour, 10 minutes? Yeah,
I can. Maybe I'll do a couple more slides for 10 minutes if that's. I guess if people don't, if they can't, they can tune out. But I know they don't want to miss. Some may have to tune out and not want to miss much.
Hey, John.
Let's do that. Let's stop at 8 today and get a couple more slides in, and then.
I think we do have quite a few people with questions too. If you don't want to press.
Oh, okay. Let's do the questions. Do the questions.
Yeah. Who was speaking just a second ago?
Oh, John, this is Gary Gibson. I was just going to ask you about your article that you released yesterday. I know that's getting way ahead, but about today being on the universal uniform Hebrew calendar, today being trumpets in the great year.
Yeah. How about that? What's your today turns out it's not only one temple, it's Feast of Trumpets on the uniform Hebrew.
So does this mean the message of the
uniform Enoch? It's one autumn. Anyway, but yeah, today's one of the holier days of the year, and yesterday was when I had the article come out. Yes.
And this year too, right? Aren't we just starting the?
And this year. Yeah, everybody, there was an article and it's really ready to read now. Yesterday I got it out on time, but I hadn't proofread it much. I think it's actually presentable now, but there's holy years. We'll have whole sections on that, but there's holy years as well as holy days. And I don't know if we can, I don't want to really start that now. I think let's do questions on tonight's stuff. But there's a new article that is significant, and it's the first one where I talked about Denver. Okay, other questions?
Okay, no problem, thanks. Okay, I'll call you a little bit later, okay?
All right. Any other questions?
I will look at, we've already talked about the next slide. Slide number 6. See, I should have one of those things, so I should look ahead to see what's coming. But the next one is just saying these sacred calendars track the average, not the actual positions of celestial bodies. Hence, the Hebrew day is at 6 p.m., not at sunset. We've covered that. Okay, so that's a good place to start. Next time, let's start next time on the week, the 7-day week, because that's really going to be important and tied to a lot of things. So if there's more questions, let's do 5 minutes more, and otherwise let's stop.
Well, I have a lot of questions, and it shows ignorance on my part, but why are there different variations of the same calendar? Because I understand we have a Venus calendar and it shows that cycle. Why would there be a variation of that? And where did they come from? And so as pertains the source. Yeah.
Oh, unfortunately, I'm the source. On the uniform versions, I can't. Oh, there's one source in Egypt, but I don't use their calendar. But we have a slide on this, but that's okay. I'll do it now, and then we'll repeat it then. The reason there's 2 versions of so many of these, there's 2 versions are all of the ones that track a celestial being, a celestial body. So Venus, Earth, Mars, the Sun, Moon, all of those have 2 versions. The ones that don't are the ones that just count days. There's no 2 ways to count days. You just count them. So the reason is this, I believe, and by the way, I don't have an answer book. This is all from my research and my best guess. but here's how it looks like the Lord uses them. The real one that tracks, let's talk about Passover, is a Hebrew holy day. You all know about the Exodus. People were in bondage. They escape. The Lord helps them to escape, usually by putting, well, let's just say that, escaping from bondage. It happened in the spring. Passover is just like Easter. Easter is really a part of a Passover thing. It's a spring holy day. If you're going to do your escaping in the spring, that works great. You can do it on Passover. But if you're locked up in your Alma in prison and it may not be spring, but you still want to be sprung from the jail, well, that's anyway. And it's winter time. Is there a way the Lord can do that and have you know that he was doing it and it was on a schedule and it's part of a big plan? The answer is yes. He has another version of the Hebrew calendar that is not tied to the seasons at all. It's just the uniform means that it just goes around throughout all of the seasons. Some people might call it floating or vague. They used to call the Mayan calendar a vague one. It wasn't vague at all. It always had, that's a good example. The Mayan calendar always had 365 days and never put in a quarter day. And that's the same one in Egypt, 365 days. Well, they knew they're about the extra quarter. These guys have been around for a long time, all of them. They're really good astronomers. They didn't want to put that in. They didn't care but if the first of the year, this year was in one season and then many years later it'd be in another season. It was more important to keep track. So there's two reasons for the uniform. Number one, you never put in leap days to correct it to match the real body in the heavens, because none of the bodies in the heavens come out an exact number of days like 365. It's always 365.242 or something, and you have to put in some leap days. The uniform versions do not put in leap days to actually track the object in the heavens. So you lose that. Venus, it's not really the springtime on Venus on the uniform Hebrew calendar. But what you gain is, number one, it's much simpler. You're not confused of, well, was this a leap year or wasn't, and how do we know when they made it a leap year? There's no uncertainty. You know exactly where it's at. If you know what one day is, you can track it forever. The other good thing about it is, if you're doing your escaping from bondage in the winter time, it can happen on Passover because it's not tied to the seasons. So you can do the whole Passover ceremony and everything and be let out of bondage on Passover when it's a different season. So the two main things for the uniform versions is celebrate the idea of one holy day at a different season than usual. And the other is you're absolutely sure what day it is, instead of wondering if you've done the intercalation is the word for putting in leap days. You won't wonder if, I've got a couple of calendars where I still wonder if I'm putting in the leap days at the right time because I don't have a manual. I don't have an instruction book. So was that clear?
It is.
You understand?
And I have one more question, is because we have 30 seconds left.
All right, short answer. Go ahead.
Your new article that you put out, that came out, it was yesterday, Holy Years Testify of Christ and His Servants. Now, pertaining to Joseph Smith, we know that his birth and death are very, very significant because it aligns with the stars, correct?
Yes.
And then for the first time, I saw something that was written up about David the servant there in section 5.2, that I've never seen portrayed that much, pertaining to things that are coming up and helping establish the truth. Like to say, is Joseph Smith, according to the heavens, aligned with God's clock? And it would appear too that, David the servant is also now is established for the first time that I've seen here in detail like this, aligned with the Lord's clock. My question is, with that criteria, up at our time right now, why should we be paying attention to calendars besides knowing that God and his servants, besides a witness for God and his servants? Why right now, why should we be caring about calendars, and why should we should be watching?
Okay, I can give a short answer straight out of the article.
Yep.
This, you haven't heard of it before because it was only discovered a couple weeks ago. I don't always wait a long time to publish something. When I'm sure it's correct, I rush into print pretty quick, especially when I feel I need to. Something happens where Denver gets up and says at the end of his 10th lecture that it's time to start fellowships, and it's time for everybody to be rebaptized. If you believe this message, it's not really optional. If you want to be part of this, baptism is required. And I don't know, he didn't say hurry every chance you get, but he said, starting now. Well, it turns out a lot of people went out. He said that on the 9th of September in 2014. On the 20th of September was a Saturday that year, and it's associated with the equinox. And I'm aware of several people, and there's probably some listening here, that were baptized. And those are the first ones I really know about, on the 20th of September, just right after the lecture. It turned out that day was the opening day of the Feast of Trumpets on, let me get it right now, the UE. It's got to be, trumpets, not tabernacles. It's in my own paper, and I've already forgotten it. It's zero. Okay, he started these lectures on the equinox, the fall equinox. So that one was the first. It's the opening day of the Feast of Trumpets, the whole year of the Feast of Trumpets. That was the autumn equinox day of the year of the Feast of Trumpets. The ones that were baptized that day it was like the opening day of the millennium. I don't know if you think that's important or not, but I think it's kind of cool. And if they waited just a week or so, it became a triple holy year. The year right after, when Denver said, do your fellowships and let's get going, we're starting a new dispensation. It was a holy year on 3 different calendars. That was my main point in that article, in that section. It was the Feast of Trumpets in one year, it was the Feast of Tabernacles in another, and it was the end of the Feast of Tabernacles in the third. All 3 of those are big holy years. Somebody who's baptized in those years I don't know, I think it's cool. The Lord has a schedule, and he's doing things. And if we follow what we're told, we tend to get in on doing things at the right time. I don't have a much better answer than that, but the purpose of these calendars to me is not to know the future. I've said what Denver does for years, that the purpose of prophecy is not to satisfy men's curiosity. It's a testimony that God had it all planned after it's fulfilled. You can look back and see, and that's why this is in the article. I have never published an article where I'm predicting anything. This has already happened. I can look back and say, wow, the year that he said get started and get going is the opening year of the millennium on one of the calendars. That, I think, is a testimony of him, and that's why I put it in the article.
Yeah, and to your point too, John, too, I think of the new TNC section 39. It used to be 52, I believe, but it's TNC 39.4. And again, I will give you a pattern in all things that you may not be deceived.
Yeah, that you may know the truth of all things, that you may not be deceived. Yeah, because Satan goeth abroad and is deceiving. Yes, that's it. That's been my watchword forever. And that's, if you want to know how I did this, that's how I did it. He gives us a pattern. And then he uses his pattern. And so when I see the pattern in one case, you can apply it to the other case and figure out what the date is. See, that's how I came up with all of these dates all through history, because there's patterns, and he does it so we'll know the truth.
And it seems like even after Denver and all of the lectures, we find out these things later, and then we go and it establishes the truthfulness of these things because it aligns with a pattern unbeknownst to us and what's even going on. And so that's why I'm really excited to hear about this.
Yes, amen. And unbeknownst to Denver, I'm sure I would be really surprised if anybody told him, by the way, be sure and do what God says, because actually it's a cruel year. They're not, because just do what God says. I mean, Noah, he goes out, he lets a dove out on a certain day and waits a week. No, he lets a raven out first, waits a week, lets a dove out, and then he lets it out again and again. Every one of those days and every one of those things in the flood story is on a special holy day. I don't think he knew anything about those all being holy days. He's following the Spirit. The Spirit tells him when to do things, or the Lord directly, revelation, whatever, inspiration, revelation. And it turns out that it's all on these meaningful holy days.
And it's all in alignment. Yeah, that's the wonder. Yeah.
In the long letter of Joseph from the prison, that part of it's totally given by inspiration. It says that these things were the times and the seasons and all of the cycles and days and hours have been hidden since the foundation of the world, and the prophets have been waiting with eagerness, some word like eagerness, they're excited for the last days when these things will be revealed about the motion of the heavens and stars and times and things. I believe this is what it's talking about. It's really exciting. You look back and say, oh my goodness, this all happened on amazing days. Everything about the Exodus was pointing to Christ. Everything about the law of Moses is pointing to Christ. I mean, on the times that they're supposed to do things. The exact time they hold the Passover meal, that's really Jesus's birthday party. Kill the lamb, have it at this time on this day. He knew they'd never do a birthday party for him. So he made it a birthday party for them. He locks them up in the womb of Egypt, and then they get to break the water, go across the Red Sea, and be born out into the wilderness of the dreary world. All of that is symbolic of him and his birth. They remember it every year because they think of it as themselves and their birth. Anyway.
And we have the stars to remind us of these things, yeah.
I just did a 10-minute answer, and it was supposed to be 30 seconds. Now that's no more questions. Hopefully this was of worth. So, but you can see where there's lots to learn.
Definitely. So with that, thank you. And If you're all right, John, if we could have the same time and place next week. And for anybody that wants to go and review those first, 5, 6 slides that we've reviewed also. And please, as you're pondering these things and as we've been taught certain things about the restoration, as you have questions, write them down. We are very, very blessed to be able to have someone who has been prepared by the Lord, I believe, if I could say so, John, prepared by the Lord to be able to answer some of these questions to help orient ourselves where we just don't have the background and knowledge as John does, because he's been doing this for how many decades, John? Astronomy?
Well, it's going on 40 years now. It's since of actual publications.
Yeah, so it's significant. So next time, whoever would join, please have your questions ready and we'll go through the slides. And if there's no other questions, let's conclude. We'll put this recording up. We'll get it over to the Restoration Archives and see what how they could post it online so that we could review it later. But unless there's any straggling questions, we'll conclude. Anybody, final thoughts? All right. I'll unmute you, Dinah, there. You could say thank you again. You were on mute, Dinah.
Oh, no.
So
Thank you, John. We love you.
Thank you, Dinah. And if any of it ever sounds too hard or I go too fast, slow me down and just feel free to ask questions, because I keep thinking everybody's born knowing this stuff, and you're not. Even a sundial, people have no idea what's a sundial. So,
all right.
Anyway, I'm glad if it's helpful. All righty, we'll do it next time.
Thank you all. We'll see you next week. Thanks.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.